On the edge of exhaustion, a single mom is just trying to survive the night shift at a roadside diner. But when the boss decides to humiliate her in front of everyone, a secret hidden in the storage room cameras flips her world upside down and forces that man to face a truth he spent years avoiding. If this story touches you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Detroit's dawn carried that sharp March cold, the kind that crawls into your bones and makes every step feel heavier. The streets were empty, lit only by flickering yellow streetlights. Keisha crossed Woodward Avenue with her bag hanging off one shoulder and a thin jacket that no longer protected her from anything. It was 4:30 in the morning, and the whole world was still asleep, except her. Her white sneakers, worn out on the sides, made a soft sound against the wet asphalt. She walked fast, not out of urgency, but out of habit. When you're a single mom, every minute matters. Every second lost is a bill you can't pay, a shift that doesn't add up, a meal that ends up simpler than it should be. Inside her bag, between an old lipstick and a few loose coins, there was a crumpled photo of Jaden, her 6-year-old son. He was smiling with those 2 missing front teeth, wearing a Spider-Man shirt she bought at a thrift store. That picture kept her going. Every time exhaustion tried to knock her down, she touched the strap of her bag and reminded herself, "It's for him. Everything is for him." The diner came into view, a low red brick building with a neon sign that read Eddie's Diner, blinking in blue and red. The smell of bacon and coffee leaked through the doorframe. Keisha pushed the glass door open and was greeted by the thick kitchen heat and the clatter of pans. She swapped her jacket for the black and white uniform in the cramped locker room, tied the apron around her waist, and pulled her hair into a tight bun. In the cracked mirror, her eyes met her own reflection. There was fatigue there, a lot of it, but there was also something no one could take away: dignity. When she stepped into the dining area, Eddie was already behind the counter, arms crossed, brow furrowed. Eddie Morrison was a man in his mid-40s, close-cut gray hair, broad shoulders, and a permanently irritated expression. Something inside him had soured these last few months. 4:37, he said, not taking his eyes off the wall clock. Keisha's stomach tightened. "Sorry, Eddie, the bus was late, and—" "I don't want excuses, Keisha. I want punctuality." His voice was cold, sharp. "Every day it's the same thing. You think customers are going to wait because you can't get yourself together?" She swallowed hard. 7 minutes. 7 damn minutes late. "It won't happen again," she whispered, looking away. "Better not. Because next time, you can find yourself another place to work." The words hit like bricks. Keisha felt her throat tighten, but she said nothing. She just nodded and went to the dining room, grabbing her tray and pen. She couldn't lose this job. Not now. Not with rent overdue, the power bill in the red, and Jaden needing new shoes. The first customers shuffled in, truckers passing through, night shift workers wrapping up, a few sleepless souls looking for hot coffee and a cheap meal. Keisha greeted everyone with a polite smile, took orders, served plates, wiped tables. Her feet already ached, but she kept going. She always kept going. Eddie watched from afar, arms still crossed, jaw tight. He didn't know Keisha had slept only 3 hours that night, that she rocked Jaden to sleep, packed his school lunch, washed the pile of dishes. He didn't know she walked 40 minutes to the bus stop because she couldn't afford 2 fares. All he saw was the lateness. All he saw was the flaw. Around 6 in the morning, the rush picked up. Table 5 wanted scrambled eggs. Table 3 complained the coffee was cold. Table 7 needed the check fast because the truck wouldn't wait. Keisha moved as fast as she could, balancing plates, smiling even when her body begged for rest. Then she tripped. Nothing major, just a small misstep near table 2. The cup wobbled on the tray, but didn't fall. No customer complained, but Eddie saw it, and Eddie didn't forgive. "Keisha!" His voice cracked through the diner like a whip. She froze. "Get over here. Now!" She felt every pair of eyes turn toward her. She walked to the counter, head low, heart racing. "You tired? Too exhausted to do your job right?" "No, because if you can't keep up, I'll find someone who can." The silence in the diner was suffocating. Even the customers stopped chewing. Keisha bit down on her lower lip, nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream, to say she was exhausted because she raised a child alone, paid bills alone, survived alone. But she said nothing. She just went back to the floor and kept working. And as the shift dragged on, something in the air said that today would be different. that the tension built over weeks of silence was about to explode. Eddie Morrison wasn't always like this. At least that's what the older employees said. There was a time he greeted the staff with a warm nod, laughed at silly jokes during slow shifts, asked about everyone's family, but that was before the divorce, before losing shared custody of his daughter, before seeing his own failures staring back at him in the mirror every morning. Now Eddie was a man rotting from the inside out. Bills piled up. His ex-wife had moved to another state with their 12-year-old daughter. He barely managed to keep up with child support. Every call from his lawyer felt like a stab. Every unanswered message from his daughter, a weight on his chest. And when the pain grew too heavy, Eddie did what many do. He took it out on whoever was closest. And Keisha was always closest. He couldn't explain why she irritated him so much. Maybe it was the way she never complained, even when she covered extra shifts. Maybe it was how she lowered her head every time he raised his voice, like she was used to being small. Or maybe it was because when he looked at her, Eddie saw everything he wasn't: resilient, dignified, persistent. Later that morning, after publicly humiliating her, Eddie went back to the tiny office in the back. The room smelled of mold and old paper, and the piles of invoices on the desk looked like they multiplied daily. He dropped into the swivel chair and rubbed his face with both hands. He was tired of everything. His phone buzzed. A message from his ex-wife. "Megan is asking to talk to you. Call her." Eddie stared at the screen for a long time but didn't reply. He didn't know what to say. How do you explain to your daughter that you failed? That you weren't the father you promised to be? That you could barely keep your own business afloat now? He locked the phone and headed back to the dining room. The rush was in full swing. Customers coming and going, orders piling up, the kitchen shouting for help. And there was Keisha, weaving between tables with that polite smile that didn't fool anyone anymore. She was drained. Anyone could see it. But Eddie didn't want to see, couldn't see. "Keisha, table 8's been waiting 10 minutes, he barked from the counter. She nodded, balancing 3 plates on her left arm while scribbling a new order with her right. Sweat slid down her forehead. Her shoulders were tense, but she didn't stop. The other employees watched quietly. Marcus, the cook, exchanged a look with Lisa, the other waitress. No one dared step in. Eddie had been unbearable lately, and confronting him meant risking your job. So they kept their heads down while Keisha carried the weight of his misplaced anger alone. Around 9, a customer complained his burger was cold. Eddie called Keisha into the kitchen in front of everyone. "You checked the temperature before serving?" I asked Marcus to redo it, but he said it was fine." "I don't care what Marcus said." Eddie slammed his hand on the counter. "You're responsible for what leaves this kitchen. If the customer isn't happy, that's on you." Keisha bit her lower lip. Tears threatened to rise, but she held them back. She wouldn't cry, not in front of him. "I'm sorry," was all she managed. Eddie rolled his eyes and shooed her away like she was nothing but a nuisance. Keisha went back to the floor, but something inside her was cracking. Every harsh word, every condescending look, every public humiliation was another drop in a cup already overflowing. The shift dragged on. Eddie kept barking orders, criticizing, watching her every move like a predator in the shadows. And Keisha kept serving, cleaning, smiling, holding everything inside. But her steps were slower, her breathing shorter. Her body was starting to give out. At noon, she asked to go to the bathroom. Eddie muttered something about her always finding excuses to stop working, but he let her go. Keisha walked down the narrow hallway toward the storage room where the employee bathroom was. But she didn't go in. She just stood there, leaning against the cold wall, trying to catch her breath. Then she felt the first stab in her chest. Sharp, terrifying. She brought a hand to her heart, trying to breathe deeply. "Just tired," she told herself. Just tired. But deep down, Keisha knew it was more than that. She knew her body was finally charging the price for months of overload, sleepless nights, skipped meals, and stacked up stress. And out there, in the dining room, Eddie kept checking the clock, irritated, with no idea that what was about to happen would change everything. The storage room at Eddie's diner was a cramped space in the back, where boxes of supplies, bags of flour, cans of tomato sauce, and plastic containers were stacked on top of each other. The lighting was dim, coming from a single flickering fluorescent bulb. The air smelled like damp cardboard and mixed spices. It was the place employees went, when they needed 1 minute of silence, far from the shouting kitchen and the customers' complaints. Keisha leaned against the cold concrete wall, her hand still pressed to her chest. The pain had eased a little, but the tightness hadn't. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe slowly, like she'd learned in a YouTube video about managing anxiety. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. But the tears came before she could stop them. They ran hot down her cheeks, silent, carrying months of built-up exhaustion. Keisha covered her mouth to muffle the sobs. She couldn't make a sound. She couldn't let anyone see. If Eddie found out she was crying, he'd use it against her. He'd say she was weak, emotional, unable to handle the pressure. She thought of Jaden, of his smile that morning when she dropped him off at school, of the way he squeezed her hand and said, "Love you, Mom," before running off to the playground. He was everything, the reason she kept going. But in that moment, alone in the dark storage room, Keisha allowed herself to wonder, for how long? How long could her body take it? How long could her mind hold up? How long could she keep being strong? What Keisha didn't know was that she wasn't alone. Not completely. In the upper right corner of the storage room, half hidden behind a metal shelf, there was a security camera. Small, discreet, installed months earlier after a few supplies went missing. Eddie rarely checked the footage, only when something big happened. But the camera was there, recording everything, every tear, every shaky breath, every second of that silent pain. Keisha wiped her face with the back of her hand and tried to pull herself together. She was just about to return to the dining room when she heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. The storage room door flew open, and Eddie stormed in like a thundercloud. "How long are you going to stay in here?" His voice echoed in the tight space. "There's a table waiting, Keisha. Or did you forget you're getting paid to work?" She pushed herself off the wall, trying to hide her swollen face. "I'm going back now." "Going back? Going back?" Eddie mocked, mimicking her tone. "You think I don't notice? Always with that, 'I'm tired. I'm not feeling well. I need a minute.' If you can't keep up, go find another place to work." Something inside Keisha snapped. She lifted her eyes, really lifted them, and looked Eddie directly in the face for the first time in weeks. "You don't know anything about me." Her voice trembled, but it was steady enough to land. Eddie stepped closer, surprised by her pushback. He wasn't used to anyone talking back, especially not her. "What did you just say?" "I said you don't know anything about me." Keisha's voice rose, all the swallowed words bursting at once. "I work double shifts, cover everyone's hours, never complain, never ask for anything. And you only know how to yell, humiliate, treat me like I'm worth nothing." Eddie opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, Keisha staggered. The pain in her chest came back fiercer this time, followed by a wave of dizziness that nearly knocked her over. She grabbed her forehead, trying to steady herself, but her legs gave out. "Keisha!" Eddie's voice changed instantly. She fell to her knees, breath shallow, cold sweat running down her neck. The world spun around her, colors blurring into a confusing smear. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Eddie rushed to her, dropping to his knees beside her. "Keisha! Hey, look at me!" For the first time in months, fear, real fear, filled his voice. He yelled for help. Marcus came running, followed by Lisa. The three of them knelt around Keisha, who was now lying on her side, eyes half closed, fighting for air. "Somebody call an ambulance!" Eddie shouted. Lisa ran for the phone. Marcus held Keisha's hand, trying to calm her. "Stay with me, Keisha. Breathe slow. Help is coming." Eddie stayed there, frozen, staring at the woman he had humiliated so many times, and for the first time, he saw her. Not the late employee, not the tired waitress, but the human being, the mother, the woman carrying a weight he never bothered to see. And in that moment, while they waited for the ambulance, Eddie felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: shame. The ambulance took Keisha around 2 in the afternoon. The paramedics said she was in physical and emotional shock, dehydrated, showing signs of extreme exhaustion. It wasn't a heart attack, but her body had simply shut down. Eddie stood at the restaurant door, watching the red and blue lights disappear down Woodward Avenue until they were gone. The silence left behind was heavy. Customers watched with morbid curiosity, then went back to their plates. Marcus and Lisa exchanged worried looks, but no one said a word. Eddie went back inside, locked himself in the office, and sat there staring at his empty hands. He tried to work, tried to look over invoices, answer emails, think about next week's menu, but he couldn't. The image of Keisha collapsing on the storage room floor wouldn't leave his mind. The way she looked at him right before fainting, the pain in her eyes, the silent accusation. 5 hours passed before Marcus knocked on the office door. "Eddie, you need to see something." The cook's voice was serious. Eddie frowned and followed him to the tiny monitoring room where the computer connected to the security cameras sat. Marcus had already opened the file. The screen showed the storage room recorded that same morning. "I was checking the footage to see if I could find anything about those missing supplies from last month," Marcus said. "But I found this." He hit play. Eddie watched Keisha enter the storage room, watched her lean against the wall, hand to her chest, watched her start to cry, and then he saw himself, storming in, yelling, humiliating, accusing. He watched in silence, jaw tight, stomach churning. Every word out of his mouth sounded cruel, unnecessary, violent. And worst of all, it wasn't the first time. Marcus had rewound other recordings from the last few weeks. Eddie watched himself yelling at Keisha in the dining room because an order was late. Watched himself call her incompetent in front of customers. Watched himself roll his eyes every time she asked to go to the bathroom. Watched her cover Lisa's shift when she was sick and still be scolded. Watched her trip and watched himself humiliate her for it. And he saw something else. Something he had never noticed. In the recordings, between one shift and another, Keisha sat in the storage room eating a single granola bar. That was her whole meal. In another clip, she massaged her swollen feet. In another, she was on the phone, voice low, saying, "Mom, please, just one more hour. I promise I'll pick Jaden up as soon as I get out of here. Please." Eddie felt his throat close. Keisha never complained, never asked for time off, never said no. She just kept going, while he dumped all his frustration, all his misdirected anger, right on top of her. Marcus crossed his arms, looking at him. "She never did anything to you, man, and you treated her like garbage." Eddie couldn't answer. He couldn't speak. The words were stuck, strangled by guilt. He stared at the screen again, at the frozen frame of Keisha on the floor, Marcus holding her hand, and him, Eddie Morrison, on his knees beside her, with the face of someone who woke up far too late. "You need to fix this," Marcus said. His voice was steady. "I don't know how, but you need to." He left the room, leaving Eddie alone with the recordings. Eddie ran his hands over his face, eyes burning. He had become exactly what he always hated, the abusive boss, the man who dumped his frustrations on the people who couldn't fight back, the coward who yelled at those who had no power to yell at him. He thought of his own father, a hard man who never praised, who demanded perfection, who punished every mistake with cutting words. Eddie grew up hating that. He swore he'd never be like that. And yet, here he was, repeating the same pattern, hurting the people around him, slowly destroying the dignity of someone who was just trying to survive. He turned off the computer and stayed there in the dark, listening to nothing but the hum of the air conditioner. He knew what he had to do. He had to go find Keisha, apologize, try to fix what he broke. But he also knew some things, once broken, never go back to what they were. Still, he had to try. He grabbed his car keys and walked out of the diner, leaving Marcus in charge. Night was falling over Detroit, and Eddie Morrison drove toward the hospital carrying a weight he himself had created. The Detroit Medical Center was about 20 minutes from the diner, but for Eddie the drive felt like hours. Every red light lasted an eternity. Every block was another chance for the guilt to squeeze tighter in his chest. He gripped the steering wheel hard, jaw clenched, thoughts spinning in circles. What was he supposed to say? How do you apologize for months of cruelty? How do you explain that you dumped all your pain onto someone who had nothing to do with it? There were no right words. Maybe there weren't enough words at all. When he finally parked at the hospital, Eddie stayed sitting in the car for a few minutes, just breathing. The lights at the entrance glowed softly, and people went in and out. Exhausted doctors, worried family members, patients in wheelchairs. Life and pain happening at the same time, like they always do. He finally stepped out of the car and walked to the front desk. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with glasses hanging from a cord around her neck, looked at him with that professional expression of someone who's seen it all. "Good evening. I'm looking for a patient. Keisha." He stopped. He realized, embarrassed, that he didn't know her last name. Months working together, and he'd never bothered to ask. "Keisha, waitress, she was brought in this afternoon." The woman typed on the computer. "Keisha Parker, Wing 3, Room 212, but visiting hours are over. Are you family?" Eddie hesitated. He wasn't, but he had to be honest. "No, I'm her boss. I need to talk to her." The receptionist studied him for a few seconds like she was deciding whether to let him through or not. Something in his face, the guilt written all over it, the weight on his shoulders, made her sigh. 10 minutes. That's it. Eddie thanked her and walked down the bright hallway, the smell of disinfectant and the muffled beeping of heart monitors filling the air. When he reached room 212, he stopped, took a deep breath, and knocked softly. "Come in." Keisha's voice sounded weak, but steady. Eddie opened the door slowly. The room was small, with a bed, a chair beside it, and a window facing the parking lot. Keisha was lying down, hooked up to an IV. Her hair was loose over her shoulders, and she wore a light blue hospital gown. But the first thing Eddie noticed was the boy. Jaden was sitting in the chair next to the bed, head resting on his mom's arm, eyes heavy with sleep. He was wearing the Spider-Man shirt Eddie recognized from the photo Keisha always carried in her bag. The boy looked up when Eddie walked in, suspicious. "Who are you?" he asked in a small voice. "Jaden, baby, go out in the hall and grab yourself some water, okay?" Keisha said softly, running her fingers through his hair. The boy hesitated, but did as he was told. He walked past Eddie with a wary look and left the room. When the door closed, the silence got heavy. Keisha looked at Eddie without saying a word. There was no rage in her eyes, just tiredness, and maybe a hint of resignation, like she'd already expected him to show up. Eddie stepped forward and stopped in the middle of the room, not knowing what to do with his hands. I came to apologize." Keisha didn't answer. She just waited. "I watched the storage room footage," he went on, voice shaking. "I saw everything. I saw what I did, what I've been doing, and I don't have an excuse." He stared at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. "I've been dealing with a lot. The divorce, my daughter, the diner, and I took it out on you, because you were there, because you never fought back, because I'm a coward." Keisha let out a long breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but full of hurt. "Do you know what it's like to wake up every day knowing you're gonna be humiliated?" she asked. "Knowing that no matter how hard you try, someone is gonna make you feel small?" Eddie shook his head, eyes brimming. "I work double shifts, Eddie. I raise my son alone. I pay rent, lights, food, medicine. And still, I showed up at your diner and gave my best, every day, because I needed that job, because my son needs me whole. And you broke me little by little." The words cut deep. Eddie felt every single one, and he knew he deserved them. "I don't know if I can fix what I did," he said, voice rough, "but I'm going to try. I'm going to change, not just with you, but with everyone, because today I saw who I've become, and I don't want to be that man." Keisha closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, there was something different there. Not forgiveness, not yet, but an opening, a possibility. "Then change," she said simply. Eddie nodded, wiped his eyes, and turned to leave. But before he reached the door, he stopped. "Thank you, Keisha, for not giving up. Even when I gave you every reason to." She didn't answer. She just watched him leave, closing the door gently behind him. In the hallway, Jaden was leaning against the wall, holding a little bottle of water. Eddie stopped in front of him and crouched down to his height. "Take good care of your mom, okay?" he said. "She's one of the strongest people I've ever met." Jaden nodded, still wary, but accepted the handshake Eddie offered. Eddie walked out of the hospital with his chest tight, but also with something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Eddie Morrison didn't sleep that night. He sat alone in his living room, staring at the framed photo of his daughter on the shelf. Megan was smiling in that picture, but Eddie knew that smile didn't exist anymore when she looked at him. He had failed as a father, he had failed as a husband, and he had failed as a human being. But for the first time in months, he was willing to change that. The next morning, Eddie got to the diner before everyone else. He sat in the office and made a list. Not a to-do list or an inventory list. A list of changes, real changes, starting with himself. When Marcus arrived to open the kitchen, he found Eddie in the dining area, rearranging shift schedules. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked, surprised. "Changing things." Eddie replied, without looking up from the paper. From today on, nobody works double shifts without comp time. Nobody covers someone else's shift without getting paid extra. And I'm done screaming at everyone like that fixes anything. Marcus folded his arms, skeptical. And you think that's all it takes? Just change the schedule and everything's fine? Eddie stopped and looked at him. No, things aren't fine. Not even close. But it's a start. And I have to start somewhere. Marcus nodded slowly. It wasn't full trust yet, but it was something. Over the next few days, Eddie did what he'd promised. He stopped yelling. When someone messed up, he talked in private. No more public humiliation. When Lisa showed up late because her kid had a fever all night, Eddie just asked if she needed anything and sent her home early at the end of her shift. When Marcus burned a whole batch of burgers because he got distracted, Eddie just said, "It happens. Make another." The staff thought it was weird. They were suspicious. But slowly the atmosphere at Eddie's diner began to change. The chatter came back. The smiles reappeared. The heaviness hanging over everyone started to lift. 5 days after her collapse, Keisha was discharged from the hospital. The doctors recommended 2 full weeks of rest. She went back to the small apartment she shared with Jaden, determined to recover but also worried. 2 weeks without working meant 2 weeks without pay, and the bills weren't going to wait. That's when the phone rang. It was Eddie. "Keisha, I know you need to rest, and I don't want you coming back before you're ready. But I want you to know, your paycheck is still coming, full, and when you come back, if you want to come back, things are going to be different." Keisha stayed quiet for a few seconds, letting it sink in. "Different how?" "I'm promoting you," he said. "Front of house supervisor, higher salary, fixed hours, no double shifts. You'll be in charge of the floor staff, training new hires, and you'll have a say in how the diner runs. If you want it, of course." Keisha felt her eyes fill. Not with sadness this time, but with something she hadn't felt in a long while. Hope. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you deserve it. You always did. And because I need to prove that change is real, not just talk." When Keisha walked back into Eddie's diner 2 weeks later, she found a different place. Eddie greeted her with a respectful handshake and formally introduced her to the team as the new supervisor. There was applause. Lisa hugged her tight. Marcus smiled and said, "Finally, someone with some sense around here." The next few months brought real transformation. Keisha implemented new training, created fairer schedules, and set up a way for everyone to speak up without fear. The diner started to thrive, not just in sales, in humanity. Eddie started going to therapy. He rebuilt contact with his daughter, apologizing honestly for his mistakes. Megan didn't forgive everything right away, but she opened a door to rebuilding, and Eddie accepted that some bridges take time. One afternoon, while Keisha was organizing the dining room, Eddie watched her talking to a new employee, patiently explaining how to take orders. She was smiling, a real smile, and Eddie realized something. He hadn't just changed her life. She had changed his too. That afternoon, Keisha picked Jaden up from school in the car she'd been able to buy with her new salary. The little boy hopped into the car, buzzing with excitement as he talked about his science project. She listened to every word, grateful to be there, grateful she'd held on, grateful she'd found strength when it felt like there was nothing left. As she drove through the streets of Detroit, Keisha glanced in the rearview mirror and caught her own reflection. There was still tiredness there. There always would be. But there was dignity too, respect, and the certainty that she was no longer invisible. Eddie's diner kept running, but now it was more than a restaurant. It was a place where people saw each other, where respect wasn't a favor, but a foundation, and where a real apology had redrawn the paths of more than one life. When you look at someone only for what they produce, you miss the chance to see what they carry. Respect isn't a favor, it's the starting point.